Good morning, everyone. This is the webinar, Preparing Your Migration Strategy with Best Practices from MDS. We have Samuel Torrero, our Azure Solutions Architect, and we will record this session.
Thank you very much, Marcela. Happy to be here with everyone. I guess we'll wait a couple of minutes more and see if everyone if more people can join, and yeah, from there we can start. All right, I think we can start with our webinar. Again, happy to be here with everyone. As Marcelo said, I'm a solutions architect for Azure Infrastructure here at MDS. And today we'll be talking about preparing our migration strategy with best practices. A little bit about what we'll be talking about. First of all, we'll have a general overview of Azure, so an understanding about what is Azure, how can we know which services it's composed of. Then we'll take a look at the infrastructure migration, a little bit about shared responsibility model, the different migration scenarios that we can have, and finally, the migration process that here at MDS we are taking. Then we'll talk about the cloud adoption framework, a general overview again of that cloud adoption framework, which is very important to understand when we are planning our projects for migrating an application. Then our main topic, so to say, will be the landing zones. So we'll be discussing a lot about landing zones, the different types of landing zones that we can have, what should a landing zone be considering, and finally, an overview about the Azure Migration and Modernization program. So before I start, I just want to remember everyone that you can post all your questions on the Q&A section on this webinar. We have people in the background making sure that everyone and each of your questions are being answered. So don't hesitate about answering, about making questions, sorry. And also, if you have any projects right now going on, also do not hesitate on getting in contact with us. We can help you to provide you with a good strategy for migration, but also with the muscle for migrating the actual application, as well as managing that. We'll be discussing all of that, of course, in the presentation. So with that said, let's kick it off with the Azure overview part. So first of all, we need to understand what is Azure. And I know that maybe most of the audience will already know what do we mean by Azure. But I just want to let this clear before we start with the actual topics. And Azure, what we mean by Azure, it's a cloud data center. And a cloud data center, it's basically a data center that it's owned by a cloud provider, in this case, Microsoft, but it can also be Google, it can also be Amazon, and all these cloud data centers, they provide services for us. And that it's the major benefit of a cloud provider. We don't have to worry anymore about physical infrastructure. We don't have to worry about cables, about physical security, about even cooling for our servers. We only have to worry about the services that we are deploying inside that cloud. Here's a quick snap of what services can we include inside Azure. As you see, there are edge devices, which are devices that can help you to connect to the cloud, but also physical. For example, Azure Stack for a hybrid cloud environment. We also have serverless services, which are services, sorry, that do not depend on any virtual infrastructure from your side. We'll understand a little bit more about this with the shared responsibility model in a few slides more. But basically, we only have to worry about the code of the applications or the functions of the applications and the data. We don't have to worry about the processing, the memory, the storage. All that is taken care for you with Microsoft on the other side. Of course, we have the most common services, which are infrastructure, and we have their compute, we have networking, we have storage, all those different services that we can have virtualized on a cloud. And finally, we are able to manage all those different services with the tools that Azure offers us, like GitHub or Visual Studio, in order to maybe automate, make more easy all the deployments and management. So with that said, let's go into infrastructure migration. And as I said, what I want to discuss first is this shared responsibility model. In the cloud, we are responsible for different things depending on the service model that we are taking. So as everybody should know, traditional on-premises means that we are responsible for networking, for storage, for server, each of the different components that our application or workload requires. It falls under our hands. We are responsible for absolutely everything. When we move to the cloud, we are no longer responsible for, say, networking. We are not responsible for physically connecting servers between each other, for making the contracts with each of the different physical server providers. We are not responsible for renewing that hardware. Microsoft is the one responsible of having the newest hardware always, of making the physical storage bigger, of virtualizing in the background. So the part that you see in blue, that is managed by the vendor. And when we use that infrastructure as a service model, we are only responsible for the operating system and above. That means we're responsible for the security, for the data, for the applications, and that's it. That is an infrastructure as a service model. Then we can evolve to the platforms as a service model. And that means we are no longer responsible for updating the operating system, for managing the middleware or runtime. We are only responsible for applications and data. And finally, we have software as a service. And that is a best example, it's Office. So with Office 365 or with Microsoft 365, we don't have to worry about the code of the application. We don't have to worry about how the application manages our data. We only have to use it. So that's the best example of software as a service, and that means that everything is taken for by the cloud vendor. And with that understanding, we also want to know which options do we have when we are considering migrating an application to Azure. As you see, we have these 6 different options when either migrating or modernizing. And they are divided into the 3 different groups that we just saw on the previous slides: infrastructure as a service, platforms as a service, and software as a service. So let's start with the first one, which is lift and shift. That one is the most common migration scenario that we can have for migrating an application. What does that mean? If the application is on premises with, say, 4 gigs of RAM and maybe 2 cores for CPU, a small application, that is the same way that it will migrate to the cloud. With the same characteristics that it has right now on premises, it will be migrating to the cloud, at least on most of the cases. If not, we'll search for something that it's very similar to that. But the goal is to make it fast. This is the fastest way to get something on the cloud, just because of that. We can maybe think about having an application on the cloud on as less as a week or something like that. It's just a matter of saying, like, copy paste your data to the cloud and then build the infrastructure, and you can start working on the cloud just like that. That is the most simple way of migrating. Then we have the replatform. For example, if you have an application that right now it's using Windows 2003, that operating system, it's no longer supported on the cloud. So what we have to do is upgrade that operating system to a newer version, and then it has support on the cloud. For example, Windows 2012. So that is basically a replatform, changing the operating system that your application has to another version, and that way making available to the cloud. Those two options are inside infrastructure as a service. So it means that we need to create virtual machines on the cloud and making sure that we are managing those virtual machines. We are responsible for upgrading, updating, patching those machines, and of course everything that has to come with that, like networking and access and security, etc. So then we move to the third option, and that is re-architecting your application. That falls under platform as a service. So what does it mean to re-architect the application? It's basically changing components of that application in order to make it cloud compatible. So for example, if you have an application that has a Windows server, um, and inside that Windows server, there is a SQL server for your database, we can change when migrating the application, that database, to an Azure SQL. That Azure SQL no longer depends on virtual infrastructure. It's a managed instance for the cloud that makes that you only have to take care about all your data and your security, and that's it. Microsoft takes care of the scaling up and down of the infrastructure. It takes care of making sure that everything is updated. So that is for a good example for re-architecting the application. Of course, we can also rebuild that application, and that means that the application will be the same, but it will have a new code in order to be developed for cloud native technology. A good example for that will be modernizing the application using Kubernetes or using microservices architecture, Azure Functions, all of those different services that no longer require you to manage virtual infrastructure. That is also a good example. And finally, we have the software as a service version, and that is completely replacing the application. Sometimes when we have, for example, a CRM that it's built in-house, we analyze our different options, we analyze the cost that we have, and maybe it's no longer a good option to migrate that application on all the different scenarios that we have, the previous four scenarios that we have. And the best option is just to replace that application. A good example would be with that same CRM, purchase, for example, Dynamics 365 or maybe Salesforce. So instead of building the application again or migrating that application, we only replace that by a product that it's out of the box, ready to be used. And of course, we also have always the option of retiring that application. Sometimes when companies are thinking about migrating to the cloud, they discover some applications that maybe have been turned off for, say, a year, and that application is no longer used. So the best practice is to just retire that application and make it so that there is no space used in the cloud for that application that it's used by no one. So those are our different migration options that we have. And we want to discuss the migration process that MDS takes when migrating an application. As you see, it's a very simple process composed by 5 steps. First of all, we are an agile company, so we use Scrum for everything inside our migration process. That Scrum, it's composed by different sprints. People have a backlog of activities per sprint, and that backlog, it's already templatized, so we don't have to worry about figuring out activities as we move on to the migration. Everything is already planned and templatized, so people know what their job is. We start first of all with the discovery of the environment in general. That means running assessments, running questionnaires and interviews with different app owners and all the people involved, all the stakeholders of that application, and understanding the general scenario. Of course, everything in our migration process is aligned with the cloud adoption framework, which we'll take a look in the next slide. That cloud option framework states that first of all, we need to have our strategy for migration ready. So we want to make sure that when we are making that discovery phase, we know everything about the motivators that we have for migrating, that every stakeholder is aware of that process, so that it's on the first discovery part. And we use tools like Mover or Azure Migrate in order to discover all the different pieces of the environment and make sure that we are making a right size of the environment and that we are only using in the cloud what needs to be used. Moving to the second phase, which is planning. That is when we start to plan the as is and the to be of the architecture. So we'll have the way that the architecture is right now, and we'll have different sessions with our clients in order to make sure that the architecture that we are proposing, it's the one that they need, that fulfills every one of their needs. It's also a good time to start approving from the different ends that need to approve when we are thinking on that migration. And also it's a time for defining the migration approach, taking one option of all the different 6 options that we saw on the previous slides, either a lift and shift, a re-architecture. All those options need to be defined on this planning phase. Then it's the time to start building the application. That means either migrating or modernizing the application. For that process, we use Terraform. That tool allows us to code what we'll deploy on the cloud. Instead of going to the portal and making, say, by hand, all the different actions, we just type code and that code gets deployed to the cloud, and that way it's a lot easier and faster to manage. So we use Terraform to make sure that everything is deployed in the correct way. We also make the configuration of the general Azure environment, specifically the landing zone, which we'll be talking about a little bit in the next slides. And of course, we also configure all the firewall and security bits and pieces for the application that we'll be migrating. Then it's time for the UAT cutover, and that means testing. Testing and making sure that from both of our ends, everything is considered, that the application is working the way it should work. We run security scans. We make sure that everything it's hardened and secured, so we have no issues in the future with that. And finally, decommissioning. So that means shutting down the servers that we have on premises, those that will no longer be used, and start using the new ones. So that is basically our migration process. As you see, it's a very fast, simple migration process. And we also want to take a look at the Cloud Option Framework. So what is the Cloud Option Framework? It's a series of best practices that has been put up together by Microsoft with the experience of their clients and partners that have gone through millions of different of migration projects. All those projects have given Microsoft the ability to come up with this 6-step or 6-phase Cloud Option Framework, which is a guide, an iterative guide to guide us when we are planning to migrate something to the cloud. I want to give a quick overview about this Cloud Option Framework because it's really important and it's the base when we are planning any cloud projects. We should really be focusing on this Cloud Option Framework when we are planning our migration. So first of all, we should understand our strategy. That means what are my motivations to start migrating to the cloud? Am I looking to migrate to the cloud because maybe we need to grow our infrastructure, or maybe we need to reach more markets, or maybe our infrastructure contract it's coming to an end and we need to figure out which is our best option to keep running my application. Maybe I'm migrating because I have compliance issues and I need the cloud to keep those compliance up to date. So what is motivating me to move to the cloud? Then what am I expecting from that migration? What is my business outcome that is expected for that migration? That it's very important because at the end, everything that has to do with the cloud and with the applications turns down into how much money am I making as a company. So it's very important for all the business people and stakeholders to have very clear business outcomes and justification in order to start that migration. And once we have those defined, we can start thinking about which is my first migration project, which is my first project that I should start with. We should start with a project that has all the abilities to demonstrate that those objectives are being accomplished. And then we can start prioritizing that backlog of migrations in order of maybe priority and risk, and we can take different decisions. Once we have that strategy defined, we can move to the second phase, which is planning. in planning, we need to know, first of all, how is my state right now? We need to make an inventory of all the different applications, servers, services, etc. that we have on premises to make sure that everything that we have will have a substitute in the cloud. Once we know all of that, we need to start also telling our organization that there will be a change. That maybe if they, I don't know, they start sometimes on an application in a particular URL, that URL may change, or that a process for your management team will change in the way that how are they managing those servers. We also need to make sure that people that will be involved on the cloud management and governance, all those people have the good and ready skills for managing on the cloud. Of course, it's not the same to manage a physical server that manage that server on the cloud. So they need to be ready, they need to be trained, they need to be certified. And we also need to take a look into our cloud adoption plan. How will we be communicating all our different organizations, stakeholders, and users about that change that we'll be having? Then it's part for a third phase, the ready phase, that it's basically configure a landing zone. A landing zone, we'll be taking a look to that in the following slides, but it's basically having everything ready in regards with security, identity, of course, access, connectivity, networking, and all those different aspects that need to be taken care of first of the migration. That landing zone, of course, it's different depending on the application that we have on the cloud. So the idea is to make this an iterative process, to expand that landing zone, make sure that we are always revising it, and making sure that if we are considering everything that can be considered, and if not, expanding the reach of that landing zone. And of course, making sure that we are using the best practices when it comes to the landing zone. Then it comes the most exciting part of adopting the cloud, which could be either migrating or innovating on the cloud. Both of them, in its own way should be very careful with, because we need to make sure that we are using the best practices again for either migrating or innovating on the cloud, which means at the end of building a new application on the cloud. We need to make sure that we are considering all the different scenarios for that application, that again, because this is an iterative process, we are improving our migration or innovation process with each round. So if maybe on the first migration, we realized that we did something that was not correct or that could be improved, we are taking all those different aspects into consideration so we can make it better the next time. And finally, we have these two phases that you can see that are covering the plan, ready, and adopt phases, which are govern and manage. Those phases are laid out like that because they should start right from the beginning of our planning phase. Govern and manage should have their own individual teams, because they are so important, not only through our migration process, but also throughout the life cycle of our application. Govern team will make sure that every methodology it's really considered, that you are taking every risk and converting that risk into something that you can manage, and you can make sure that it's considered, so it's not a security risk. It also needs to be measured in time continuously to make sure that everything it's inside the guardrails that have been defined. And that means using, for example, Azure policy in order to take care of the consumption, to take care of the security, to take care of all the different aspects that need to be controlled. It also means that you can evolve again, because it's an iterative process, that you can evolve that govern methodology and make sure that if right now you are maybe not considering, I should put some guardrails on the, for example, on the sandbox environment, so people cannot make crazy big machines. That is something that can keep maturing throughout the way as we manage our govern methodology. And of course, we have this other team, which is the manage team. That team will make sure that everything is updated, that everything is configured in the right way. It'll make sure that we have different categories for our application. So of course, it's not the same to manage an application that has low risk than a mission critical application. So the managed team needs to make sure that they have the correct processes in place to manage those applications. Again, here's a slide to quickly tell you about the different migration and modernization triggers that we have right now for the cloud. You can see that there's compliance, there are security threats, there is application innovation, all those different options. It's a good starting point to analyze migrating to the cloud. So basically, the idea is start, look for your trigger, look for your motivation to migrate to the cloud, and then we can start talking about the different strategies that we have and make it a reality. And let's move to the second part of the landing zones, which is on the ready phase of the cloud option framework. That ready phase, you will recall, it means having everything ready before our migration. That means the landing zone. What is a landing zone? We can make an analogy of a landing zone with a city. So when we are, for example, planning to migrate to, to build a house or to build a building for an architect, first, instead of just starting to build that house or building, they need to make sure that water systems, electricity, gas, and all the different components that they need to have ready prior to start building, all those components are good and ready to go. The landing zone is exactly the same. Instead of just migrating the application and start putting workloads and servers and databases on the cloud, we need to first consider different aspects of the landing zone for the time that the applications come to live on the cloud. Which are those aspects? We'll see a bit more about on the next slide, but basically we can consider, for example, identity and access management, policies, security, monitoring, all those different aspects of a landing zone. And the idea of a landing zone is to have a repeatable process for configuring those applications. It should not be something that takes a lot of time. It should be a piece of code that is very easy to deploy on the cloud and that we can keep modifying depending on the application that we'll be migrating. So which areas do we need to take into consideration when building that landing zone? Those areas are divided into two main groups. First of all, the environmental areas, and second, the compliance areas. When we are talking about those environment areas, we see that we have Azure Billing and Azure Active Directory. That's very important. First of all, Azure Billing means how will we be managing all the different consumption that we have on the cloud? Will we be making maybe chargeback to our different organization areas, or maybe it's just a centralized billing identity? Active Directory, how will we be identifying our users when we have guests, when we have users that are inside our organization? We need to take into account that identity provider that will be making sure that people that logs into the cloud, into a server, into an application, it's identified and obviously secured. Also, identity and access management, it's not only in terms of what people are logging into the cloud environment or to the servers, but what are those people able to do? So we need to have the correct roles and permissions set up for the different people that will be interacting with our environment. Also, resource organization. It's very common that companies that start with the cloud start making, for example, different names for their servers, and after 1 or 2 years, they come back and try to figure out what that name means. So we need to have right from the beginning naming conventions. We need to have a clear and good organization strategy for how will we be organizing our different resources, and of course, how will we be connecting our cloud with our on-premises data center, but also with the internet? How will we be securing those connections? That needs to be taken care of right from the beginning prior to migrating any application. And also from the compliance side, we need to take care of security. So if my application, for example, will be public, people from the world will have access, for example, to a web application, we need to make sure that everything is secured, like with Azure DDoS protection, for example, or we need to configure right from the beginning services like Defender for Cloud, or maybe Azure Sentinel or Azure Security Center, or all those different services that take security into account. Also governance, as I said previously on the cloud option framework slide, we need to configure Azure policy in order to make sure that consumption, machine sizes, security, permissions, all that it's controlled from the governance side. Management, how we will be monitoring our applications, which activities will we have to perform in order to manage those servers and make sure that they are updated. May consider if we have to make, for example, some automation playbooks in order to not lose time on getting into each of the servers and updating them manually. And of course, automation and DevOps. How can we make our deployments faster, repeatable, and how can we make that our people that are building applications constantly on the cloud do not lose time on maybe activities that can be automated and can be tracked with Azure DevOps. So all those different areas of design can be considering when we are thinking about our landing zone. But of course, not every application it's the same. Not every application will need all those different design areas. And how can we know which design areas our application will need? First of all, we need to make sure about which cloud operations model do we have. And to understand that, we need to understand the foundations in the cloud. So what do I mean by foundations? First of all, we have workloads. If you are, for example, a software company that only dedicates to building an application and maintaining that application, you may have only a workload. And that means that application that it's your core business. But if you have, for example, multiple applications, or if you are a company that it's managing your clients' workloads, then you'll need a landing zone. That landing zone needs to take into account all those different design areas depending on the application, and needs to consider them for the different workloads. And we can also have different landing zones for the different applications that we can have for the different workloads. So now that we understand those different concepts that can be available for different companies, we need to choose our operating model for the cloud. First of all, if you only have a workload, then you can have decentralized operations. That means I only need to take care of that application. Maybe in those kind of companies that only focus on that application, the same team that codes the application is responsible for the security, it's responsible for scaling up and down the application, it's responsible for managing, governing the application architecture and services. We can also have in more traditional companies a centralized operations, and that is I would say the most common operation model that we can find. The centralized IT team that manages everything on the cloud, and the different applications teams that need to set up a ticket, for example, to that central IT team in order to make that machine bigger, or turn it off, or turn it on, or maybe manage something about security. So that is centralized operations. We can also have enterprise operations, and that is when we have a more democratic service, so to say. If we have an application team that knows their way around to the cloud, and that knows how to manage security and everything that that application needs, then maybe we have only policies and guardrails that make sure that that team has their operations controlled, but that they have some certain amount of freedom to manage their own business and their own cloud regarding that application. And of course, we can also have distributed operation. And that means a little bit of everything, basically. Maybe if you are a global company that have many different locations around the globe, sometimes you'll have in one location a centralized operation because of the way that application functions, and you'll have sometimes in another location an enterprise operation because those teams know better how to manage the cloud. So the idea it's to understand on which model are you, If you are looking, for example, for a little bit more of innovation, maybe you are on the decentralized operation. If you're looking for a little bit more of control, you are centralized operation. And the goal is to know on which cloud operation model you are. And so when you know that, you'll know which landing zone it's better for you. And which landing zone types do we have from that landing cloud operation model? First of all, we need to take into account the conceptual architecture of a landing zone. That architecture, it's the goal of every landing zone. It should take into account the ability to scale in and out the different components of the environment. It should take into account security, all the best practices that are considered from Microsoft with the customers and partner practices. It should have a really strong foundation for management, for security, for governance. And when we have this conceptual architecture in mind, we can start thinking about which landing zone model it's good for me. First of all, we have two different models. The start small and expand model, and the start with enterprise scale. Those two different models are good for different companies depending on the approach that they have. Azure has, or Microsoft has, what they call Azure landing zone accelerators, and that means they have templates that are ready to be deployed. You should, when starting a migration and a landing zone, you should go into those landing zone accelerators and make sure that if there's anyone that fits the application, you deploy that. Why? Because it will save you time. It's a an experience that it's based on the portal, so it's very quickly, and you only need to hit deploy, maybe configure one of two parts, and that's it. You don't need to take care about anything else. It will be deployed automatically inside your environment. But sometimes those templates are not what you need, and you need to start customizing those templates. When can we need those? Could we need those customization? First of all, if the implementation does not represent how you operate services, and also if your organizations maybe have different controls that require, for example, compliance or something around security. That is when we start with those different those two different approaches that I just told you about. The start small and expand and the enterprise scale. First of all, start small and expand. If maybe you are migrating an application that has low risk and that it's not public or something like that, then maybe you don't need to take into account all those 6 different or 8 different design areas of a landing zone. You only need the basics. You only need the most easy part of the landing zone in order to start working on the cloud, and that it's only use what you need and no more. And after that, you can keep growing that approach because it's again it's an iterative process. So you can keep growing that approach in order to make it maybe more secure or to consider more governance and compliance parts depending on how your application is running. But the idea is to really make this quick, make it fast, and make sure that everything is considered. If this is not good for you, then we can go with enterprise scale, and that means take everything into consideration right from the beginning. So going back into the cloud operation models, if you are, for example, a global company that has all those different cloud operation models, you'll maybe benefit from this enterprise scale model. Why? Because mostly on most of the times, those companies need, for example, compliance for their applications. So when configuring a landing zone that has everything taken into consideration, you are making sure that compliance is built in right from the beginning. Or maybe security, or maybe governance, because there are so many teams interacting with each other because it's such a big application. And that way, with the landing zone, all those different teams are controlled. So the goal is to identify on which operating model you are, and then which landing zone fits best for you. Sometimes you have to migrate a ton of applications in a very short amount of time. Again, this is a good opportunity for enterprise scale. But basically, if you don't need compliance, if you don't need to migrate a ton of applications, if you are a small company, you can start with that start small and expand approach. and make sure that you are learning everything that a landing zone could give you with each iteration of the process. And of course, we not only have those templates that I talked to you about at the beginning, we also have partner and an open source landing zone options. Those are, for example, partners like us, like MDS. We have developed through time different landing zone models that could be available to you. So those landing zones are ready to be deployed. You can get in contact with us, and we can make sure that we have the landing zone model that best fits your need. And there are also open source models like Terraform modules. Those Terraform modules are ready to deploy landing zones that are available on different Microsoft resources. And those, again, can be deployed just as the templates that I talked at the beginning of this topic of landing zones. So just as a brief, we have all these different options for when to start with our landing zone, either start small landing zones or enterprise scale landing zones. Excuse me. Sorry about that. And we need also to make sure that we are considering the partner landing zones, the third-party landing zones, and the accelerators, which is the default option. If we already have something that it's built and that we can make use of, then there is no need to build our own thing. We can use those templates. And we are coming to the end of our presentation. I just want to talk really quickly about the Azure Migration and Modernization program. This program, it's a set of benefits that Microsoft has configured for the migration clients. Those clients that are looking to either migrate or modernize an application to Azure are able to be nominated by partners like us, like MDS. And when we nominate a client, they'll have access to all these different benefits. So they'll have access, of course, to the proven methodology of the Cloud Option Framework and the well-architected framework. They'll also have access to skill building, so to training and certifications through that program. They'll have access to assistance from fast-track Azure engineers to the Azure engineers that are working on the client side. They'll have access to help from partners like us. They'll have access to tools for their migration like Azure Migrate. And of course, Microsoft is also willing to co-invest with you on that migration, either with Azure consumption credits or also with credits for the actual migration activities. So if you have a migration project in mind, don't hesitate to get in contact with us. We can see if you are applicable for this program and nominate you, and make sure that Microsoft is also co-investing with you on your migration project. And that will basically be all from my side. I really hope that this was of help to you, that you could find value on all these different topics that we reviewed today. Please do not hesitate again on getting in contact with us if you have any migration project, if you have any questions. We have a really big set of expert people that can help you with all that. We can provide you with training, we can provide you with migration services, we can provide you with managed services, and even with just the strategy and planning phases if you are hesitated about which path should you take when migrating that application. So again, thank you very much for your time. Really enjoyed being here, and I hope that this was again of value to you. Thank you, and until the next time.